our previous videos, we already discussed about shared scope and inherited scope available as part of AngularJS. Now it's time to learn about isolated scope in AngularJS and the two as part of directives. First of all, what exactly is isolated scope? Let us imagine I have some markup and a template associated with the controller called sample, and as you know, once we have any kind of controller set up on a particular template, we are going to have that one to be automatically creating a scope on its own. And imagine in this case the parent scope or the controller scope itself is having two members called A and B with values 10 and 20 respectively. And we can understand like these two values will be automatically be rendered here as part of one-way binding. So this is a very typical scenario, and we do not have any kind of isolated scopes here. So let us imagine I'm actually creating a new directive called message, and you can see I'm creating a message, and imagine that message is being applied to this element div. And there is something new here, that is this scope. Whenever you specify a scope with an empty object or any kind of object in general here, you are essentially creating an isolated scope. So when I mention isolated scope, it is the scope which is completely independent of the controller or parent scope. This scope will have no relation with the parent scope. So which means these two are independent of each other and neither of the two will know about the other. So you can see directive creates their own scope. Whenever you specify scope as object, they will be completely separated out of the parent scope, and they can have their own members. And there is no relation and there is no inheritance which actually comes from the parent scope at all. And modifications to any of the isolated scope members. So if you happen to modify new members or modify the existing members available as part of the isolated scope, those will not have any kind of effect on the parent scope. And even if you modify anything on the parent, it will not apply anything to the isolated. So those two are independent, and none of the modifications to any of the two will be having any effect on the other. Next, we know that we have the parent scope and we also have the isolated scope, which is mainly available whenever you mention the directive as scope of an object. But there could be chances, or you will be running into a particular scenario where you would like to access these two members of the parent right inside the isolated scope. So you cannot really run away from the parent scope most of the times, even though your particular directive may be completely isolated, but there are chances that you might still be using or may need to use any of those particular members available in the parent scope. If such is the case, there should be a way to access or communicate with outside world other than just isolated scope. So in fact, this isolated scope may need to access any of the parent scope or probably some other scope. So for that, we have various ways. And one of the ways is using the scope parameters ways. Even the scope parameters themselves have various ways. So scope parameters is something like a concept available to isolated scope whenever you would like to access or provide some kind of integration to outside world from within your isolated scope. Which means, imagine I would like to access the parent scope from the isolated scope, you can use scope parameters. Similarly, imagine I would like to execute something or some function in the parent right from isolated, you can do that. Similarly, imagine I would like to send some values from the isolated scope back to the parent scope, you can still achieve that. So all of that you can achieve through scope parameters. And you can see I mentioned @symbol, equal to symbol, and even ampersand symbol. These three are three different types of scope parameters which can be provided whenever you are defining an isolated scope. So let us check each of them. So scope parameters as scope members. This is very important. So I'm going to come back to as scope members later, but just imagine scope parameters, how they are really different from each other whenever you are providing @ or equal to or ampersand. First of all, what do you mean by ampersand here? So ampersand means it is just a string value, whatever you would like to pass from the parent or outside world to the isolated scope. So whenever you would like to provide a value or pass a value from outside world or a parent scope into the isolated scope, @ is the simplest way to do. And again I say one way, so which means it always goes from the parent or outside into the isolated, but it will not go back. And this particular string, whatever you provide for the @symbol, could also be an interpolated string, which means it could be an Angular expression, like something like this kind of an expression, which will be evaluated by AngularJS framework before even sending that value directly inside isolated scope. So the next one is equal to symbol. So whenever I specify equal to symbol as part of the scope parameters, you are saying that you are likely to provide an object but not a string. So which means you will be defining your own JSON object which will be sent from the parent back to the isolated scope, or say into the isolated scope. And I mentioned this is two-way binding, so which means whenever you send that object into the isolated scope, it is actually sent in the form of reference. So whenever you modify the values in that object right inside the isolated scope, those will also be affected on the parent scope or outside world. So it is a two-way bound. So whenever you use equal to symbol as part of the scope parameter, you are essentially saying that please get the values from the outside world into the isolated scope. Not only that, but whenever you modify anything inside the isolated scope, those values also need to be reflected back to the outside world. And the next one is ampersand symbol. So whenever you specify ampersand symbol as part of your scope parameters, you are essentially saying that okay, I have a function in this scope. You can access that function right inside this isolated scope. So which means whenever I would like to have this isolated scope to be executing a function available in some other scope, then you will be using ampersand symbol. And there is no binding here as because you are not really working with values, but instead you are working with function. So you can send a function from here all the way to isolated scope, so that isolated scope can call back that particular function available somewhere else, and that can be achieved using ampersand symbol. So directive can execute a function passed to it using ampersand symbol. So these are all the pretty much standard ways on how you can really communicate between the parent scope and the isolated scope. Not just those, but there is one another way to really accomplish few of the other tasks, that is using the $parent. So whenever you specify $parent, which means you are literally accessing this scope right inside your isolated scope. So you can say, like within this isolated scope, I can say scope.parent.a.parent.b, which can actually give the values from the parent scope right inside your isolated scope. While that is possible technically, try to avoid it, as because your particular isolated scope literally will be depending and very much tightly integrated with the parent scope, and this might not be able to be reused elsewhere until and unless the parent really has those particular parameters. So until and unless there is no way you can really do something using parameters, probably you can go with $parent. So this is just available as a very last convenient method, but let us try ourselves keeping away from using $parent. Okay, let us jump into a couple examples so that we can really understand how this isolated scope can be programmed and how to use all the scope based parameters. So I have a simple JavaScript file here which essentially says that I have a controller called sample, and it has got 4 members A, B, and P and Q. So we have 10 and 20 for A and B, and 11 and 12 for P and Q. And I'm trying to have all of these members just to be displayed directly as part of my markup. So here I'm going to say controller A equal to value A, similarly B, P, and Q. So I have all the values displayed here, and let me delete this. So I would like to have a new directive to be created here. So instead of creating it first, let us make sure that this is working. So I just wanted to specify here. So let me open even my developer tools. So you can see I have all the values A, B, P, and Q displayed. And now I would like to have a new directive to be created. So in that case, I would like to say something like info message is going to be my template for the directive. And in this case, I would like to have a new div with values A and even B to be displayed. So all I'm trying to accomplish here is that I would like to have A and B values to be displayed right from the directive itself. So I need to define a directive here so that it actually points to that template. So I'm going to say directive message, and in this case I would like to have a new function to be defined. So inside this function I'm just returning my template. So the template URL is going to be whatever the template I have created, which is infomessage.html is my template. So I just would like to have this one to be displayed. And as I mentioned, if you would like to work with shared scope, you don't need to provide any scope attribute here, or you can just provide scope equal to files. So imagine I'm not really doing any of this and I just press F5 here. And of course I need to actually add that particular directive right into the markup. So that is forgotten. So let me have an HR here and let me give something like directive 1 instance 1 and div with message is my directive, and I would like to have that directive to be displayed. Nothing much special here. So all I'm doing is I'm using this directive right inside my template, and just would like to have that particular markup to actually display this template, which can bring these two values from either its own scope or from the parent scope if available. So press F5 and now you can see I have 10 and 20 which are currently being retrieved from the parent, as because currently it is working with shared scope, and it is working with shared scope as because I did not specify anything with respect to the scope attribute. But the moment I specify scope with an object as presented earlier, I'm saying that I really want to have a complete independent scope for this directive which has got no connection or no relation with the parent. So the moment I say that and press F5 here, now you can see I have A and B completely out of sync because this has got its own scope. So let me go here and try to access this guy and get the scope out of it. So once I open the scope, you can see I have ID as 3. So which means this is not going to be the same ID as for this controller. So let me open the controller here. And if I open the controller related scope, you can see I have ID as 2 and it has got A, B, P and Q. So I have all the 4 members for the parent scope, but the moment I have gone through the directive scope, you are not going to see the same ID, and also the ID is different, and at the same time you do not have access to A, B and C. And if you see the prototype also, you are not going to see any kind of inheritance from the parent, as you must have seen in inherited scope in my previous video. So this is not even inherited, this is not shared, and this is completely independent on its own. But as I mentioned, I would like to have some values to be actually sent from some other controller or parent scope or some other world to my particular directive. So if such is the case, I need to say that my scope, whatever is available here, should be expecting a couple of parameters from somewhere else. So I am going to say, okay, expect a value for A and expect a value for B in the form of strings. Why I am using A and B? Because I am using the same variables here, A and B. So the most important thing is that whenever you define in this fashion, you are saying that please create 2 members called A and B inside the isolated scope. So our particular scope for this directive is going to have 2 members, A and B. However, the values of those 2 members are actually coming from some external parameters, that is in this case @ symbol. So whenever it is external, it knows that based on the respective symbol you use here, it has to fetch the values based on the definition of that particular symbol. So if you specify @ you are saying that please give me the string. If you specify equal to, it works with objects. If you specify ampersand, it works with functions. So let us start one by one. So let us start with ampersand, which is @ symbol, which is quite simple. It just needs strings. So let me go back here And inside this markup, I'm going to say, like, I'm providing values a as something like high, and I'm saying b equal to something like jag. So I'm saying high jag. So the value high will be actually sent to this a, so which means that value high will be assigned to this member variable a directly. And similarly, we are going to see jag to be actually assigned to this member variable b, and these two are members inside the isolated scope, and that scope related members are not at all accessible anywhere else. So this a and b has got no relation with this a and b at all, and you are using this a and b right inside your template. So that is important. So if your template says x and y here, you are essentially saying that please use x and y from the current scope. So which means I have to say I am specifying x and I am specifying y here. That actually says that you would like to use x and y here. So this directive expects two values x and y as parameters, and those two values will be assigned automatically to those two members of the isolated scope, which will be automatically rendered as part of your template whatever you have defined. So let me press F5 and you should be able to see x and y with values high and jag. So if now I go to this scope and try to access the scope object of that particular current one, you can see the ID is still 3, but you have two new members called x and y which have the values high and jag. So those two are the two different values you have in place. Okay, so let us take this one further a bit. So that is, I would like to have something like a new markup. So let us go with the instance 2 in this case. So as part of the second instance, I really want to have x value, but not in the form of plain constant strings, but instead I would like to have the values to be actually retrieved from the parent scope. So that is, you can see p is what you are trying to access here. So you are trying to display the value from the parent scope right inside here. The same value needs to be sent as parameter to x. So which means the scope related member variable x is going to have the value of p, and similarly q. So you can interpolate it. That's what I'm saying. So if you are not familiar with interpolation or parsing or evaluation as part of AngularJs, please refer to my previous videos. So you can say I'm specifying please get the value of p from the parent scope, assign that to x, so that indeed will actually go to this x, and similarly this q will be going to y, and finally to this y. So let us see if I have the same values of p and q to x and y respectively as part of my application. And now you can see the second directive is having two different values 11, 12, which are essentially nothing but p and q from the parent. So you can specify any constant values, or my directive can also access the values from the parent or from any other outside world just by sending in some values, just like the way you are really doing some kind of data binding. So again, this is one way, because @symbol in AngularJS as part of this scope parameter is always one-way binding. So which means directive tries to get the values from outside world, but it cannot send the values outside of the directive to somewhere. Okay, so it is not just only this, you can also have some kind of interpolation to be done. So it doesn't mean just only p, but instead you can provide some angular expression here, something like p star 10, and similarly I can also say q star 10. So that is also valid. So let's save this and go back here and press F5. And now you should be able to see like x and y are actually getting the values from p and q by multiplying their values by 10. So 11 into 10 becomes 110, and 22 into 10 becomes 220. So you achieved that using string interpolation, which is going to be evaluated whenever that particular value is supposed to be passed to the scope member of the isolated scope. Okay, the next thing is that imagine I would like to have different parameter names to be provided. However, those are still assigned to same x and y in our isolated scope. So that can be achieved actually by modifying our directive. So let's not really worry about this directive. I'm going to create another directive here, and I would like to call this one as message2. And still it goes with template URL info HTML, so which means I still wanted to use same x and y being actually displaying the values of x and y respectively. However, I am saying that this particular x will be getting a value from something different. That is, in this case, let us consider I am specifying m and I am specifying n. So this is still valid. So what I'm saying here is that I'm expecting the value of x and y from the markup with m and n attributes respectively. So now I can go back to my markup. So let me say something like another blank tag there. And in this case, I can specify something like m and n. So now the scope members are different from whatever the attributes you are specifying here. So you can also provide something like 8, which needs to be retrieved from our parent. So in this case, I'm using this a and this b to be sent as m and n. However, those m and n will be assigned to x and y respectively, which will be displayed as part of x and y in the template. So if you do not specify any m or n here, which means anything other than @ is not available here, the scope will be expecting exactly the same as the member names like x and y. But if you provide something other than whatever you have in place x and y, like m and n or a and b or d, e, f or whatever, those attributes are what going to be considered in order to have the values to be passed to respective scope members. So let us see if this is working. And now you can see, okay, I'm missing something. I do not have x and y values here. So let us go back and see what's going on. So I'm using message2. So yes, I actually missed this message2 right here. So this is directive 2 actually, and this is instance 1. So that was the typo, and let me press F5, and now you should be able to see x and y are having values from the parent a and b, even though you are specifying m and n in between. Okay, so that is pretty much about how you can pass @ variables, @ based scope parameters. What I mean to say is, now imagine I would like to have the same isolated scope to be accessible from the directive related controller. So you can still achieve that. So right now I do not have that, so let me create a new controller as part of the directive itself. So in this case, I would like to say something like controller function, and this particular function can have 3 parameters. The first one is always going to be scope, second one is element, and attributes. So this is the directive related controller. So now I am trying to access the scope. So whenever you are trying to access the scope here, it is nothing but the local scope. So when I say local scope, it is nothing but the isolated scope in this case. So you are essentially accessing this scope right inside this. And you can still add members as many as possible, like something like I can say scope.z equal to 40. Even this is valid. So you can add as many members as possible and modify the scope object right here. So the scope, whatever you have in place, is already accessible here, and still you can modify that. So now I'm going to add a new method, something like doProcess, and I just would like to have that one as a function, and I'd like to have some result to be calculated here, where I would like to have the scope.x to be converted to integer, and again scope.y to be also converted to integer, and finally just alert the sum itself. So I would like to have something like this. So I'm accessing x and y of the current scope, and I would like to have those two to be added and placed in OR, and finally display the value of sum. I need to access this one somewhere. This do process is a function which needs to be executed from somewhere else. So in this case, I would like to have that one to be made available as part of my template. So this button I would like to call something like show, and upon clicking at that, I would like to execute do process. So I go back here, press F5, and we are going to see all the buttons for each of those directives. So in this case, it doesn't make sense, and you can see it is giving some not a number because we're trying to convert that one to integer. So in this case, hi jag is not a number, so it is not going to calculate anything there. But in this case, it should give me some value as 33 and 330, and this is not going to work because this is a different directive which has got no definition of the do process. So you can see this one doesn't have the controller, so I can still have the same controller in this one as well, which is trying to access x and y respectively and tries to display the sum. So I can still work with that one in the same way as the other. So in that way, we can still access the scope related, isolated scope related members as part of your controller, that too in your directive controller. Okay, so now that we are done with @symbol, now is the time to work with equal to symbol. So let me remove everything I have in place. So I do not want to use symbols anymore. So I just wanted to clear off everything whatever I would place. So let me comment this whole thing. And I would like to comment this whole thing too. And also I would like to comment this guy. And let me comment this whole thing as well. So I'm going to have new markup, new controller, and new template. So let me start with the controller. So in this case, I would like to have a new scope object to be created. The new scope member called EMP, which is going to be an object. So in this case, I would like to have employee number to be specified as something like 1001 and employee name to be something like Jag. So this is just an object assigned to the scope member, and the object has got two properties, employee number and employee name, which are assigned with 1001 and Jag respectively. And imagine I would like to access that as part of my template, and the directive based template. So I have to modify my template. So in this case, I would like to have employee name is going to be something different. So as part of that, I actually wanted to have a new directive to be created. So let me create a directive right here. So as part of this directive, I would like to say something like app.directive, and I'm going to say message, and as part of this one, I'm going to say return my template info message.html. So this is my template here, and I would like to specify the scope. So this is my isolated scope, and here I am saying that I am expecting a member called employee to be actually provided in the form of an object. So earlier we were using @symbol, which is just a string from the markup. So in this case, this is not going to be a string from external world. It is going to be an object which needs to be sent into the directive, and this is two-way, which means if you happen to modify anything inside your local scope here, that will also affect the outer scope. So that is what I'm going to modify here. And now we need to go back to our a01.html, and I'm going to say, first of all, controller employee number equals the name of the object, so that is emp dot employee number, and I'm going to say employee name equals that is emp dot name. So let us not create the directive instances yet. and let us ensure that everything is working fine. So just press F5. So you can say I got 101 and jag. So I'm not working with the directives yet. So let me have the directive instances to be created right here. So I'm going to say directive1 instance 1, and I'm going to say div, and as part of this I am going to say the name of the directive what I'm going to use is message. So that is the directive I'm going to use, and it is expecting employee, so I need that right here. So I'm going to say it is expecting an employee member, and that is going to be an object, and that particular object right now from the parent is available in the form of emp. So the same object I am going to send to my particular parameter. So which means the parent has emp, the same emp is going to be assigned to this attribute, and in turn that gets assigned to this object employee, and the same employee I need to use it in my info message. So in this case I am going to say employee.employee number, and at the same time I am going to say employee name equals employee.employee name. So pretty important is that you are trying to access the object available in the current scope, that is the isolated scope. So this is what you are referring in your template, and this isolated scope is going to receive the object from some other external world, and in this case we have the parent which is actually having the object in the form of emp, which is going to be sent to this employee. So let us see if everything is working fine. I go in here, and now you can see the directive has got an object called 1001 and an employee name itself. So if necessary I can just go in here, I open this, and let us see what it has in the scope. You can see scope ID 3, and it has got an employee as an object, and it has got two members, employee number and employee name, which are nothing but the ones which have been assigned to this guy. So in that way, now our particular directive is capable of displaying any object as long as those have employee number and employee name. So in this case I have only employee 1. So imagine if I am creating something like employee 2. So I can say employee 2 as 1002, and this is going to be something like Scott. So I can still have this employee 2 to be displayed by some other directive. So I am going to say instance 2 is supposed to have employee 2. So you can see the same directive is being consumed but with a different object, but the same different object is still adhered to the same structure as of the previous one. So I go back here and press F5, and now you should be able to see 1002 with Scott, and the previous one still working with jag. So that is another way of actually sending the equals. And you can still work with just like you are renaming your scope parameters, you can still rename in the same fashion here also. So let us consider I would like to rename my parameters. So in this case I would like to have message 2, but this one, imagine it is supposed to be retrieving from OEMP, something like that. So the markup should have an attribute called OEMP, and it should have an object. That object is going to be sent to employee. So let me go back to markup here, and inside the markup I am going to say, okay, this is going to be new directive. So let me have a new BR tag here and another BR tag here, and okay, I need to have this one to be closed, and this is going to be another directive, and this is instance 1 of directive 2. However, I am going to use message 2 as my directive, and at the same time I need to specify OEMP. So in this case I can just use the convention of AngularJS like O-EMP. So -E can be automatically considered as uppercase E as part of this one. So let me see if everything is still working fine, and now you can see even though I specified with a different attribute, you are still having the same thing. So let us say I'm directly specifying just OEMP without any hyphens or dashes. So let me retrieve this. You can see it is not working at the moment because the convention is that it really needs to have dash. So whenever you are having it, so that is essential. Okay, so in that way I have the equal to symbol working with objects, and that too in the two-way binding. Of course we did not see the two-way binding, so let us see even the two-way binding as well. So now in my controller I would like to have employee name to be actually modified using the input. So okay, let me remove everything here. So which means I would like to have a two-way binding to employee name. So in this case I am going to say employee name needs to be modified by the user if at all possible using a text box. So I'm saying that employee name is going to be bound to this text box. So if I modify this, it has to modify wherever this EMP is currently available. So let me see if that two-way binding is really doing the way it is supposed to. So let me press F5, and now you can see I have 1001 jag, 1001 jag, and I have a jag here. So the moment I modify here, you can see the value is automatically being modified at two other places, as because it is having a watcher to be created on this one, and for every modification you can see the digest cycle really kicks in and it updates all of the respective variables including the isolated scopes. So this is just another way, and let us consider I'm trying to modify that right inside my directive. So I go back here and I would like to have the same thing, the input tag bound to employee.ename. So this is inside the directive. So let me go back and press F5, and now you should be able to see the text box here, but let me give a break so that it actually comes to the next line. So now you can see I have jag here, and imagine I'm modifying here, which also modifies the parent, as because it is two-way bound. So the parent will also be modified as because you are working with the objects. And similarly, if I modify here, it works from the parent to the directive, and this is from the directive to the parent. So you have two-way binding to be accomplished using equal to symbol in the scope parameters of a custom directive using the isolated scope. Okay. So till now we have seen on how we can accomplish certain communication to be happening between the isolated scope and the parent scope. There is one last thing which we need to cover, that is ampersand symbol. So let me clear everything. So okay. So this could be a bit different. So let me clear everything here, and let me remove all the directives, and probably everything from here except A and B. So I just wanted to have A and B to be made available here, and even in here I do not want anything other than just A and B. So I would like to have A and B to be just there and the respective things to be removed. Okay, yes. Okay, so let us ensure everything is working fine. So just press F5, and now you can see I have plain controller A and A and B values and no directives present. Okay, now I would like to have the ampersand symbol to be working as part of our scope parameters in isolated scope. So but we still need to have the directives to be specified. So in this case I would like to have something like P and Q to be defined as part of my template. So inside my template I would like to say something like div P equals P and Q equals Q. And let me put a breakpoint. Sorry, not a breakpoint, it is break tag. So let me put a break tag there. And the next thing is that I would like to have the sum to be calculated inside the parent controller. So the parent controller is going to have the logic of calculation of sum. So I am going to say scope.doSum equals function x comma y. You can just provide any values there, any variables there, and like to have sum to be calculated by actually parsing. Let me put a variable parse int of x plus parse int of y. So I have the sum to be calculated, which needs to be displayed right here. Okay, so I have alerts which are displaying, I have alert which is displaying the sum of x and y. So currently these x and y are not really having values, so you are going to provide the values for this one whenever you call the function doSum. Okay, so right now I'm not calling it yet. So let me call that directly from the controller and check if it is functioning. So we are not having anything to be working on this one yet. So this is nothing. So I can just comment this one for now. So in the controller, I would like to have something like the button, and I would like to have sum to be calculated, and I would like to execute my doSum with A and B coming from the scope. So this A and B, whatever we have in place there, so those two values will be automatically retrieved and passed to doSum here, and we are going to have the sum to be calculated. Still, I do not have any directives, no isolated scope, nothing. So just press F5 here, and the moment I click on sum, yes, we do have the sum. Okay, let me put a break here. Okay, so now let us work with the directive. So I go back here. I just would like to define a new directive, message function. So as part of this function, I would like to have the template, a URL to be my info message, that is infomessage.html. And now I need to specify the isolated scope. So in this case, I would like to define the isolated scope with empty. However, my intention is I would like to execute this function from my isolated scope. So this directive has got no connection with this one. And at the same time, still this isolated scope, which is completely independent of the parent, needs to access this doSum. So it doesn't matter how it finds doSum, but what I'm going to say here is that it needs some external sum function to be provided. That's it. It just needs the definition of the function to be provided, and that definition is going to be assigned to a new function name called extsum inside this isolated scope. So just like doSum, I'm specifying a method or a function called extsum inside the isolated scope, and I'm expecting this function to be supplied from some external source. And as you are working with functions, you have to specify ampersand. So if you specify equals, it is object. If you specify @symbol, it is string or interpolated string. But if you are specifying functions, or if you are sending the definition of the functions, it is going to be the ampersand symbol, where it will be accepting any function definition which will be assigned to this member called extsum. Okay, so now that I have the definition to be sent, this one doesn't have any values. So imagine I would like to have some values to be provided as part of this info message. So I'm going to say something like P and Q to be actually provided in the form of input. So that is text boxes equals P, and similarly Q value also to be provided in the form of text box. So this is important to understand, like this P and Q are inside the isolated scope. We are not getting these values from anywhere else. So those are inside the isolated scope and accessible and modified inside the isolated scope. These are not dependent on any other external sources. So now that I have those two values, all I'm going to say is please execute using a button. So I'm going to say please execute the sum button, and whenever I would like to have the sum button to be executed, I need to specify some ng-click. Okay, so this is important. So as part of this, how do I do and what do I do? So let us not really do any ng-click at the moment. So this is dummy sum button at the moment, which does not do anything. I just wanted to make sure we have everything in place and everything is working. And of course I still need to have my directive instance to be actually created here. So I'm going to say an HR here, and I'm going to say directive1 instance1 and a div, and inside the div I just would like to have my directive message. That's all for now. And of course this is expecting ext sum, so which is nothing but the function. So I'm going to say ext-sum, because s is a capital one here. I would like to have a preceding value of dash here. So let me bring this one to first one. Okay, ext-sum is actually going to have the definition of do sum. That's it. So what I'm specifying here is that ext-sum is an attribute which will be corresponding to the definition of do sum of the parent. So the parent is already having the definition, this one. So you are just sending this whole function. You are not executing the function. You are sending this definition of this function. This whole function will be sent to ext-sum, and in turn that gets assigned to this ext-sum. So which means you are saying that this whole part is being assigned right here. So you're not executing it. You are just getting this whole function and getting assigned to this member called ext-sum, which can be executed later on as part of the same directive. So that is how you are sending it. And now let us see how to execute it. So in order to execute it, obviously we already have the ext-sum, which can be executed right using our button. So I'm going to say, what is the name of the function here? ext-sum. So this is the one which has the definition of the function. So I go in here and I would like to have the ext-sum function to be executed. So now you can say you are calling the function by providing two values of p and q. So I can just specify I would like to have p and q to be sent as parameters to that particular function. So you have local p and local q available as part of isolated scope, which will be provided by the user in the form of text boxes, and they will be assigned to p and q member variables of the local scope, and those two values are going to be sent to ext-sum, which is nothing but this one, and this is nothing but this do sum, and this do sum is nothing but this do sum. So this function is going to receive p and q here, which in turn executes this whole part. So let us make sure that all of the things are saved, and let us see if this is working fine. I go in here and now you can say I do not have any values. So let me try to provide some value 5 and 6. So let us see what we have in here as part of the scope itself. So let us open the scope. Now you can say I have ID is 3 and you have p value as 5 and q value as 6. You can also see ext-sum, which has got the definition of the function. So that is going to be executed the moment you click on sum. So let me clear everything and click on sum, and you are going to see sum value 11 being displayed, and you can still modify this and you will be able to get some value to be displayed. So you are able to execute a function external to the isolated scope and available somewhere else by just sending that whole function definition as a parameter to your isolated scope member. So that is how you can use ampersand symbol. And there are a couple of ways on trying to achieve the same, and most of the time you will be seeing different kinds of syntaxes whenever you are trying to execute this. So one of the frequently used syntax is sending the parameters in the form of an object, but not like this way, but in the form of an object. So let us see that example as well. And in this case I would like to say do sum. So let me comment this guy, or probably let me put directive1 instance 2, so that we know that we are working on instance 2. So we are still going to have ext-sum. You are going to send do sum, but here some kind of understanding like it has two parameters m and n. You can just provide something like that. So which will be very much similar to x and y. You can also use x and y. I just wanted to differentiate that these two doesn't need to be the same as these two. But the ordering is important. So when you are trying to execute that as part of your info HTML, so I need to comment this. Why? Because I am going to change the definition of info. So I need to comment this. So let me execute this one in a different way. So now I am going to have a button and I am going to say sum to be executed. And of course I need to provide ngClick. Okay, so instead of calling this way, I am going to call extsum again, but in a bit different way. That is by sending an object. So I'm going to send an object which will have two values and which means two properties, and I'm going to say the value of m will be nothing but p, the value of n will be nothing but q. So which means p and q are assigned to m and n respectively and sending this whole object. So this m and n will be automatically made available to this function in the same order, and the same m and n will be further sent to x and y, which will be doing the do-sum respectively. So this is somewhat very confusing way. I myself prefer to go this way, but most of the time online you will be seeing these kind of examples, so which are essentially nothing but you will be sending the parameters in the form of a function, and that particular sending the parameters in the form of an object, and that particular object is going to have all the parameters laid out in a particular order, and all those parameters should match the same order here. So it doesn't matter what value you provide here, m or n, but the first value p is going to be assigned to x, the first value q is going to be assigned to y. So that is pretty much it. So that is a kind of a syntax what everyone is usually doing. And you can see still I have some to be working. So that is just another way of accomplishing things. And on top of that, I can still have my own controller related functions also to be achieved. So for example, I can have a controller to be defined as part of this one. So I can say controller, so that is a directive based controller. I can say $scope, $element, and $address, that is attributes. So inside this controller I can still execute this external sum. So as you know, everything is accessible through scope. So this scope is local scope, that is our isolated scope which is already having this member. So I am going to say please execute this sum, and just like you did earlier, I have m and n which needs to be sent. So I will be sending the same thing here. So I am going to say this is the object, and that particular object needs to be sending the value of p from the current scope, and the second parameter is going to be q from the current scope. And this is a function, and I am saying that this inside the controller I had to define a method. So that is, I would like to say do process equal to function. So I am actually going to add a method which needs to be executed by some other button. So this is the way on how I would like to accomplish things. So inside the controller I am going to have a new function to be added to the scope, and that particular function is going to execute some other external function by getting the values from the current scope and sending them in the same order as they have been defined in the attributes. So now I go back to info message, and now I can define another button. So let me comment this guy, and this is also sum. However, in the ngClick I am going to specify just do process. So I'm saying that please execute my function currently available in the current scope of this directive. So whenever I say do process, this actually goes to here, and this one is going to execute this external sum by getting the values from the current scope, that is p and q respectively, which will be passed to x and y respectively. So let us see if this is working fine. And Okay, let me see. This is directive instance 2, and this should work with no issues. So let me go back here and let me assign with 10 and 20 and click on here, and now you can see I still have 30. So let me make sure that it is really having the values from the current one. So that is just another way of having the do sum to be executed, that is some external functions to be executed. And you can also modify that with some other way. That is, imagine I would like to have a different specification of my attribute, something like just sum, just like my previous equal symbol or @ symbol. You can provide something different here. So that in fact says that I can specify just sum right here instead of ext sum. So I can just say just, which means this just sum is going to be assigned to this ext sum, just like you are renaming the scope parameter at the time of the markup. So this should still work fine with no issues. So 8 and 9 and click sum, and still you are going to have the sum to be displayed. So that is just another way of doing things. And finally, as I mentioned, you still have access to the scope related parent. So that is one thing we need to understand. Like if I go back here and if I go to the scope, so let us go to the scope here, probably this guy. So let me get access to the scope. So right now you can see it has got P and Q and even the ext sum and even the do process. But now you can see it has also got the parent. So every time an isolated scope is created, it has a reference to $parent. So if you open $parent, you are going to see $ID 2, which with A and B, and also do sum. You can see all these three members are actually available right here. So you have A and B and sum. So this parent is currently accessible directly through $parent. So that is also accessible directly from your isolated scope. So now I can say $parent.a or $parent.b right from my scope. So in fact, I can say something like the Q value, for example. I would like to have the Q value to be multiplied with scope.parent.a. So this is the value I'm going to send. So what I'm saying is that I would like to have the current value of Q to be retrieved from the current scope, multiply that value with A from the parent scope, and get that value and send that value as Y, and finally X and Y need to be summed up. So let us see if this is working. So I go in here, I specify 5 and I specify 6. So 6 needs to be multiplied with A, so which is 10. So 6 into 10 becomes 60. 60 plus 5, which is value of P, becomes 65. And you can see I have 65 to be automatically retrieved. So if I have 7 or 8, you can see I have 85.